Report Card with Nat Malkus, where we evaluate research policy and practice efforts to improve the lives of families, schools, and students. Now, most of the time on the Report Card, we talk K-12 education. But sometimes we delve into higher education, and that's what we're going to do today. A lot of the policy prescriptions that we've been hearing in the U.S. revolve around free college, equity and access to universities, and student loans and student debt. But today, I want to bring on two guests, one, Jason Delisle, my colleague at AEI, and his co-author, Alex Usher, who's the president of Higher Education Strategy Associates, who co-edited a new book released this week titled International Perspectives in Higher Education. I talked to them about their book and what the U.S. can learn, or maybe can't learn, from other countries' higher education policies. Before we begin the conversation, I have a couple of announcements. The day this podcast drops, January 24th, AEI is having another installment of our education policy debate series. We will debate the motion, "The Supreme Court was wrong on Rodriguez. There should be a federal right to education," with four fantastic external debaters, and the audience will get to decide the motion. It starts at 5:45 here at AEI in Washington, D.C., and if you're in town, there's a few spots left. Also, on February 4th, Senator Lamar Alexander will come to AEI to deliver a keynote and introduce his new proposal for higher education reform. If you're in Washington, D.C. on February 4th, we'll hope you can join us at AEI for these events. If not, you can watch online by visiting aei.org. Now, let's turn to Jason and Alex to discuss international perspectives in higher education. Jason and Alex, welcome to the Report Card.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, this is a great occasion to have you back. Publication of this edited volume. So let me push back right away on sort of the whole perspective on the book. It's called International Perspectives in Higher Education, but really it's applying it to the U.S. context, right?
Yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is, do people really make a lot of comparisons between American context and others? I just don't necessarily know if I see this in the popular press. I mean, where's this coming from?
Yeah, I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, you didn't see it much because, the line was we had the best system in the world. And so why would we look abroad for any ideas to do it better? We're doing it the best. But in recent years, there's been anxiety over college costs. There's anxiety over student debt. And so the sort of inclination is to look and say, well, how do other countries do it? Do they do it this way? Have they figured out a different way to do it? Is something else possible? And so you get the comparisons a lot. The goal of the book, though, was the comparisons that are made are often off the cuff. They may be a sentence in passing. They're very superficial, and they cherry pick. They don't really give you the whole story when someone is looking abroad for something that the U.S. should do to solve some of our higher ed problems.
Yeah, so they did this in K-12. Actually, there's a reverse, maybe more a decade ago than they did now. Everybody wanted to be Finland, right? Let's make the U.S. education system like Finland. Which is not that hard, I suppose, to just export Finland to the United States. So what are some of the stars in the international firmament of higher education systems?
If we're talking student loans, it's Australia. If we're talking free tuition, it's Germany. I'd say those are the two big ones.
All right, well, let's pick up on Australia. I mean, Australia's great. Their higher education system's great, right? Why?
Well, you see people point to Australia because they have a student loan program. So this comes, I think the Australia example, Alex is totally right. That, we see it in the U.S. policy space with student loan anxiety, right? So student loans are unaffordable. Well, let's look at Australia has this student loan system where people pay based on their income. Isn't that great? Well, we actually have that. Another difference is that in Australia, you make your loan payments as part of your income tax withholding. So it's not, it looks different than what we have here.
Okay, so let me summarize this again, because that's a big thing you just said there. They do not write checks to sort of a company that services the loan. They pay through whatever their equivalent of their 1040 is.
That's right.
Okay.
So the money that's coming out of your paycheck to pay your federal taxes, some of that goes to your student loan.
Yep, Australia, New Zealand, UK, that's all true. It's a source deduction.
Okay, well, that sounds actually like it would make a lot of sense. So why does that not live up to the hype?
I think it does make a lot of sense. And this is the thing, right? So this is the superficial thing. It's like, hey, wouldn't that be great? That's a great way of doing it. End of conversation. But Alex knows a ton about this because he's looked at it. And we can flip the switch and do this, right? Tomorrow?
You're the one who wrote the report on this, right? It requires you got a tax system that works in a particular way. and there's a lot of changes that would be needed to the overall tax system in the U.S. for this to really work. One of them is that you're doing taxes on families rather than individuals to a certain extent, right? And that does change the way that you do deductions. If taxes are on an individual basis and there's nothing to do with the family, this is really easy to implement.
Right, and that's the system in Australia and the UK.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's sort of this, so think about it this way. We do taxes in this country at the household level. That's our tax policy. It's our tax law. That's a big deal. You ain't changing that. So it's sort of like this whole, why don't we do this Australia thing, actually requires having a tax system that would be based on an individual. If you did it, if you tried to sort of put it onto our system where we do household taxes, you'd have a situation where, for example, I have a student loan, my wife doesn't. How would her employer know to withhold student loan payments from her paycheck when I have the student loan? Technically, there would have to be a way to do that. That would be an amazing system if we could set something like that up.
It's like those internet links. One quick trick to change the tax system from individuals to households.
I mean, the other thing about Australia that people really like is it's not just the defaults are low for students, but it's that governments get most of their money back, right? So I think people see it as efficient for governments and not just efficient for students. And I think there's two things that you got to be careful about here in terms of transposing it to an American system. And the first is that they restricted the students who could take this effectively to people who were in four-year publics. Now, the U.S. student loan system would look a lot better. All those statistics you hear about defaults and everything else, it would look a lot better if you only took the statistics for four-year publics, right? So in expanding it, and recently, I guess it was about a decade ago, they did expand it to the equivalent of 2 years here in the U.S. And all of a sudden they found, oh, wow, we're losing a lot of money. And so they've now had to change things and change their threshold policy and things like that. The other thing is that you got to remember government controls tuition fee policy in Australia. So it doesn't really accommodate a lot of choice, and it keeps debt relatively low because it's just the system they have. One of the things that we're seeing in the UK right now is that if you have an income contingent loan system like Australia style, which the UK does, but you combine that with very large student debts of the kind that are not necessarily typical in the U.S., but certainly the kinds that we always hear about, the $50,000, $100,000 debts, that just doesn't work. It's really hard to make that work. And so that the size of the debt is an issue as well. Yeah. And we sort of ignore that in the, let's just take Australia and move it over here.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, right? So you hear this, let's do like Australia does, and then you start looking at it closer, and you're like, well, but there's more that goes along with the Australian approach than just saying, let's have payments based on income. And Alex's point on they only offer the loans to people with bachelor's degrees. Good luck trying to propose that in this country, taking loans away from people in community colleges, right? That's also part of the Australian
Well, that's a non-starter, but it brings me, so I didn't read the full title, right? And the subtitle really brings through some of the emphasis in the book, International Perspectives in Higher Education.
Wait, you haven't even read the subtitle yet?
Oh,
you mean on air. Okay, all right, sorry.
International Perspectives in Higher Education, Balancing Access, Equity, and Cost. And so right in there is implicit, just like in your comments, there's trade-offs to be made. Can you just talk me through those 3 points and where the trade-offs might lie between access, equity, and cost?
These themes that sort of emerged when we were doing this project was if a country, if they're the sort of the exemplar that someone is pointing to because they're doing something really well in terms of keeping costs down. More often than not, what you find is they're sort of sacrificing some other goal to get there. So if they're keeping tuition really low and therefore, paying a lot of government money for, to subsidize tuition, you'll actually see cases where that hurts access to college because the government can't afford to subsidize very many slots because it's so expensive. Right? So this is sort of this there's this push and pull between these different goals, and they are in tension. And when you look at these examples, you see it more often than not that one is sacrificed for the other. And I think when people make the comparisons in the U.S., there's sort of this implication that, we don't need to worry about trade-offs. We'll just take the good parts from all these systems. And I think that really, you just end up in a place where, that just really boils down to just spending a lot more money.
Yeah. Right. So to give you an example here, I think Germany and free tuition is probably a pretty good example. So yeah, they spend about, as a percentage of GDP, they spend about 20% more than the United States does on public expenditures on public institutions. The difference is that in the United States, you double that or more than double it when you take all the tuition fees into account. And so overall, the U.S. puts about twice as much money into higher education as Germany does. So you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, how do Germans run universities? Well, there's a bunch of ways they do it. One is they take in fewer students. And those students that they take in tend to be actually more privileged in many ways than American students, because they stream out a lot of students at age 11, 12.
So relative to us, they've got an access problem.
They do have, in many ways they do, yeah. The other thing they do is they pay their profs a lot less, right? I mean, that's a very simple way to keep costs down, is just stop paying profs so much.
Right.
I wouldn't say one is right and one is wrong. It's simply a matter of trade-offs. And I think, the point of the book is not to say that the set of trade-offs that have been embodied in the United States are ideal, but there are historical reasons why those trade-offs were made. And you can learn a lot from about your own policies by studying the choices other people made. Sometimes you don't even realize the choices that are embedded in your own policies. And so, I think what we're trying to do here is to show people, if you spend the time not just to understand the policy, but understand the trade-offs beneath the policy, you'll actually be better informed when making policies here in the United States.
Well, it's really interesting that you bring this up, because I'm wondering, where is the reference group? And by that, I mean, I would like to say, well, how does the U.S. stack up? Where are we weak? Are we weak on access? Or are we weak on equity? Or are we weak on cost? And the idea behind that question is that there is a reference group. There's some normative place where you should be on any of those levels. So it's sort of hard to put the U.S. in a ranking on all those three things. Am I right on this?
Well, no, I mean, Alex is the guy on this. I mean, he knows more about this than I do, and almost anybody does.
America's still the number one country in the world when it comes to research at universities. There's nowhere in the world that comes close to the research enterprise at American universities. Where the United States has lost a lot of its lead in the last 20, 25 years is on access, right? And it's not that it's behind a lot of other countries, but a lot of other countries have caught up.
Okay.
And they've caught up in many ways by examining the American experience. But I think now that everybody's caught up, so, I think people would say Finland is ahead on that, and in some ways you would say Canada's ahead or South Korea's ahead, and each of them they've designed their system in different ways. There are things to be learned from those experiences. Can they be transported? That's tougher. I mean, especially when it comes to access, a lot of it has to do with policy at the secondary school level, where you do have some pretty striking inequalities in the United States, which you wouldn't say in Finland or maybe South Korea. And so the lessons there, you may not be able to bring those over, but they're still there. I think there's things to learn there. The big question, I would say, I think what's moved international comparisons to center stage in the United States, though, is cost, it is tuition, it is student debt. And there are one or two countries where we've seen, numbers like the United States, and one of them is Chile, where tuition was very expensive in local terms, if not in American terms. And we've got a fantastic essay in this book from Andres Bernasconi from Catholic University in Santiago on the Chilean reaction to high fees, which was to create a kind of a targeted free tuition system, right? Which is, in some ways, to my mind, it resembles a lot what the Democrats have tried to do in the state of New York, actually, which is to say, below a certain level, it's free, but above a certain level, you pay.
And that level is income of the student, right?
Parent.
Of the parent.
Right, yeah. So Chile has a really interesting tax system, which is that when you get your tax return back, it tells you which income decile you're in. There's a couple countries in Latin America that do this. And then your access to social services, you just flash them your tax number, and they know which decile you're in. So this is kind of a way of doing means-tested fee. So in Chile, it's simply if your family are in the bottom 6 income decile, so the bottom 60%, and that's about 30% of all students, you pay nothing.
Huh. How about that?
Yeah. I think the parallels with the New York free college, the Excelsior Scholarship is what the New York one is called. Sort of this, again, there are issues and trade-offs that everybody should understand with these kinds of programs. And what's interesting is I think the Chile and the New York example sort of exhibit those together. So, for example, Chile had targeted aid to low-income students before this. Mm-hmm. And so the increase in benefit to them from making it free versus lots of targeted aid has been relatively small. But for a middle-class family, the increase in benefit is quite high because they were paying most of the tuition and now that it's free. So the same thing this is one of the same criticisms leveled against like the New York program would be that, well, the really big winners here are sort of middle class and upper middle class who weren't receiving much aid before. But don't fool yourself that you're going to be driving lots of benefits to low-income families. They were already getting a lot of aid.
Through Pell.
Right, yeah. Through Pell Grants in this case. And yes, and also through, yeah, that's right.
So let me ask you about Brazil. Because Brazil has a fascinating history in the secondary and elementary level of how they've moved things around for folks at different income and different urbanicity. What do we know about Brazil, and how is it used as a reference point for where America should go, and should we buy it?
Nat, now I'm starting to think like maybe you have read the book, because we have a chapter in there.
All right. What do you know?
On Brazil.
How could I know?
Okay, all right. I mean, one of the things not a major focus of our chapter on Brazil, but, part of this pattern here. So in Brazil, public higher education is free in Brazil, right? So, this is what everybody wants. Right. Oh, what a great example. Yeah, so
they're beating up on the cost side.
Yeah, so
right?
they have free college, but, because free is expensive for governments, you can't offer a lot of it. You only have so many slots, and when you're a university and you have only so many slots, well, what do? You get really selective. So if you get really selective, you only let in the best students. Turns out the best students are from the highest income families. So now you've got a free public university system only available to the wealthiest families. That's how their free system works. For everybody else, they have, and this is going to sound familiar to U.S. audiences, government grants and loans, or loans for sure, federal loans that you can get to go to a for-profit college. That's mainly the alternative.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of Catholic colleges in there as well, but it is the for-profits where the expansion has been. Huh. And I think what's interesting about Brazil is it is a place where the private sector has really driven costs down, which has not always been the experience here in the United States. And it's a very, very competitive system. It's interesting because my consulting firm, we do a lot of international comparisons. We were trying to figure out what tuition was at Brazilian private universities, and we couldn't do it because actually if you go to their website, they'll install cookies, and if you come back to their website a second time and a third time, the tuition will be lower. It's a very, tuition is not, it is not something, so they could never do like what the Department of Education does and actually sort of say this is what tuition is at every institution, because tuition's just a number to get you in the door. It's very, very interesting. Go to some websites in Brazil. They are really quite something.
So I know that the U.S. audiences here, who've learned about the sort of for-profit issues in our higher education system and some of the attempts to sort of crack down on low quality. And what is Brazil? Why is it better? Like, are they getting better results, or is it just cheaper?
It's designed to serve the more disadvantaged folks that can't get into the public university system. Yeah. So we have this access problem, but it's not how I would have guessed it would have lined up. It seems like it's a product of zero cost.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, it means zero cost for the public
students. Yeah, for the students.
Yeah. Like, because it's sort of like, well, what about everybody else? And you have these institutions cropping up.
Yeah, and in fact, the policies that allowed the private institutions to thrive were actually that was Lula's doing in many ways. Is he wanted to expand access. There was no way he was going to touch tuition fees of the public institution. That's the biggest third rail there is in Brazil, I would say, and in many of free tuition countries. Right. France would be another one. So he put in place a set of tax credits and tax benefits for private institutions if they would specifically if they let in low-income students. So they've got to monitor their intake. And if they're giving scholarships, cost breaks to low-income students, then they get some public funding. So they're private institutions. They do get a little bit of public funding, but it's dependent on an access mission. So you can see why it's interesting. It's a left-wing government that's put in place some very market-oriented policies to expand higher education to underserved communities. Now, not everybody's convinced this is actually quality education. Is it really university level? That kind of stuff. That's just another trade-off, though.
And then there's this debate about these sort of policy proposals, and my understanding is some of them took effect of because of concerns that for-profit institutions were just enrolling anybody. They're just sopping up these government loans. Sound familiar, right? This is the issue people complain about in the United States. The response from the government in Brazil was, well, let's have some eligibility criteria for these loans on the students, that they would have to meet a certain score on a national test before they could get them, which that's certainly one way to go about it, right? And that's a pragmatic solution. You can't just enroll anybody now. You have to enroll better prepared students or students who are more likely to do well. But man, try to bring that to the United States.
Yeah, I'm going to make a prediction that that's not going to fly in the U.S.
Yeah. But this is one of these great lessons of sort of looking abroad where you realize it's not always a case of, we just haven't thought of that, or there's some, ingenious approach. I mean, that is actually a very sort of practical, pragmatic approach to this. The problem for us in the United States is it just absolutely cuts against our value of higher education is supposed to be about opportunity. It's supposed to be about second chances. And we are not going to have merit requirements for federal student loans. I predict probably never.
And there's a parallel here to go back to Germany, which is they have sort of a bifurcated education system, and you test early on, right? And if you test into the college track, you go college track. And if not, well, you don't go to college. Am I wrong there?
So there's a little bit of laddering going on these days.
Right.
It's a little more permeable than it used to be. But yeah, basically, you're right.
And the culture really accepts that in a way that they wouldn't in America.
You have to remember that with all of their vocational training, there's less of a gap socially between those who go to college and those who don't, right? So part of it is, I mean, I would argue, social mobility might still be reasonably well served by a track like Germany's, which does track people early and does keep a limited number of people in these, the equivalent of 4-year publics. But to do that, you have to have a massive investment into vocational secondary education. You have to have a massive investment into skills training after that, and an apprenticeship system that has levels of coordination between government and business, which are really hard to imagine in a country like the United States, where, the capitalism's a little more red-blooded, let's put it that way.
Right, but it seems very in line with sort of some of the watchwords and the thesis of the book, which is, one, you just can't port that system over here. We're just not ready for it. And the other thing that you had mentioned earlier is that, your secondary education system dictates a lot of how your post-secondary education system is going to work. So you can't just assume that a German post-secondary attribute can just be ported over and work easily on top of our secondary system.
Yeah, there's an interesting, one of the chapters in the book actually has an interesting comparison between the UK and Germany and their access system, and how there's sort of this interesting thing is that you end up in kind of similar places in the end, in terms of what people have access to and what kinds of degrees they earn. You just do it in a very different way, the sort of the sorting. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think at the top end of academic achievement and at the bottom end of academic achievement, where you end up socially is going to be pretty similar no matter where you are. It's really a matter of how you sort the middle tiers, I think. And you get some very different ways of doing it. It's not impossible to change secondary pathways into post-secondary. I mean, I look at France is probably the best example. They used to be a lot more like Germany, and they're now a lot more like the U.S. in the sense that almost all roads now do lead to college one way or the other. But it's taken them 20, 25 years to do that. Like this is not something you can do overnight. There's a lot of moving pieces in the system, and it takes a lot of successive reforms to do it. It's not a silver bullet.
The mechanism.
How many times do we use the phrase silver bullet?
I don't know how many times. We might just use silver bullet like once or twice. But yeah, I mean, the book is definitely getting at, you will be disappointed if you go looking for silver bullets, or be very suspicious of someone who tells you there's a silver bullet abroad for higher education reform.
So let me give you the challenge question, which is, who's the closest to a silver bullet? Is there a system out there? Now, I know that you can't port it over immediately to America, but is there one that just is really knocking it out of the park on multiple levels that is worth taking a look at to figure out how we might get a little closer to that direction?
You're going to look at me, right?
I'm going to look at Alex. I mean, I'll just say that when we look at some of the OECD data, this isn't necessarily in the book, but Luxembourg stands out. But, part of the secret sauce there is everyone's wealthy.
Yeah, like average income's like $90,000 a head.
Yeah, I mean, so really, and that is the silver bullet is everyone is wealthy.
Yeah. So I actually think there are 2 or 3 systems that probably look pretty good internationally on multiple measures. And if you'll forgive me saying this, one of them's Canada, and one of them is the Netherlands. I think those are countries where you've got a large number of institutions that look very good internationally. Not Ivy League good, but solidly top 200, top 400 institutions in the world, where you have not just a good 4-year track, but you've got good vocational and professional education outside universities. You got high levels of access and not outrageous amounts of debt. And the amount of public money that goes in is not terrible either. Now, there's lots of problems with both of those. And from the American context, neither of them stand out as particularly beneficial because neither of them has a substantial private sector, right? I mean, it is the private sector in the U.S., and I'm not talking for-profit here, but not-for-profit, that really does make the United States very sui generis. There's nothing like that anywhere else. I mean, you can argue there's a couple in Korea, there's a couple in Japan, but there's not a quarter of the system here. And a lot of it is a social hierarchy system, right? I mean, a lot of the contortions that parents of American teenagers go through every, sort of September to January every year. A lot of it is about, my kid goes to, you want them to go to a school that you'll be proud to talk about at a barbecue, next summer or over Thanksgiving dinner and that kind of thing. that is a status competition that is not unique to America, but it is more pronounced here than elsewhere. And it does change the nature of the debate quite a bit, I think. And it's not just because of things like U.S. News and World Report. It's not just a rankings game. It does have to do with who gets access to our ruling class. To be honest, I mean, that we've given that task to colleges, not just the United States, but a lot of the world has given that task to, if you get into this institution, your future is made.
And it's enmeshed deeply enough in American life that it is evidenced at our barbecues.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, that's the other thing that, we talk about this sort of anxiety around college costs and tuition and student loans. And so we're sort of looking abroad for some solution. But, I mean, I'm not convinced that American families want cheaper higher education. Mm-hmm. I mean, there is a lot of sort of revealed preference out there of them scrambling, like you're describing, to go to more expensive schools. Yeah. They want to spend the money. They want to complain about it too, because wouldn't it be great to get great things for less money? We all want that. It
is great to get good things for free.
This is, again, back to this sort of trade-offs theme. I think, we talked about Germany a little bit, and you could see, one way to keep tuition down or keep tuition at zero would be to radically cut how much our universities spend on instruction and on research.
And student living conditions. And buildings,
right? Like, we can go bare bones, activate that through public policy channels at our public universities, and I don't know that people would be all that happy with that.
I mean, I can see from as an outsider perspective here, being Canadian, one of the things that struck me as we were doing this book is the extent to which one of the trade-offs that clearly is valued by the United States, by the American public in a way it's not necessarily abroad, is choice. An awful lot of the decisions that get made in policy are about protecting choice, subsidizing choice. Nobody does that anywhere else. Like, it's just not the same kind of value. And maybe it shouldn't be a value in the United States. I don't know. But I think it's so embedded in the American system, it would be difficult to pull out. And there must be good reasons why it's there.
So an alternative subtitle could be balancing access, equity, and cost with choice. International systems might do a little bit better job at.
Well, they certainly tilt the other way. I don't know if it's better, but yeah.
Less choice. Less choice abroad. Better. Right? And we have more choice, and we do favor choice. I mean, if you look at our federal program, try to do a K-12 voucher from the federal government that includes private schools. No way, right? That's a hard thing to do. That's a lightning rod.
That's right.
The Pell Grant program, which is a voucher for higher education, goes to private schools. Good luck trying to propose that it shouldn't go to private colleges, right? So choice is hugely important in the federal system. Now, what I think is interesting is that some of these free college proposals are only for publics, right? They only apply to public universities. Mm-hmm. In New York, there's a little bit of a token gesture towards the privates, but none of them really want to participate in it. But this free college thing, the money that's going for it is only for the publics. And I don't know. We haven't really seen backlash yet on that. I mean, or it's been suppressed. I don't know. But at least, when we start talking about federal proposals, like Senator Bernie Sanders' proposals or Hillary Clinton's proposals, they wanted to channel federal money to states to make college free only at public institutions, which is a huge break from the policies that we've had historically that have promoted choice, to Alex's point. And I don't think that issue really got the sort of exposure it should have, because I think people would have been pretty upset by that.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I mean, we never got close enough to find out. But, in a sense, there are lots of people now who go to private universities when they could go to public ones, because there's a prestige factor associated with it. And who knows, for those people, the fact that you made public education free might make the private ones even more prestigious and therefore even more desirable, right? I mean, so in some ways, I think one of the reasons that they didn't attract a lot of criticism was precisely because the cost is not an issue to that 25% of parents who are on the private side. I don't know. I mean, this is an outsider's view.
Well, there's another question. It seems to me that the downstream consequences of free college for elite public institutions would be that access to them would either have to be regulated or they would just take the best students out there, which, again, happen to be relatively wealthy, right? So if you restrict free college to the public sector, then public elite institutions are all the more elite.
Right. They could become more selective because you could actually get students and families who are saying, I was going to go to a private, but University of Virginia is now free. And they would say, well, that's now on my list. And suddenly their applicant pool gets bigger and it gets higher quality, students with better test scores, and they get more selective. Another thing you'll get is there's a lot of complaints in the sort of policy and the advocacy world that public universities, in the face of sort of budget cuts, are chasing students from out of state to get that full tuition. You could really exacerbate that trend by doing free college. It's not immediately apparent why that might happen, but say, for example, if I'm a university in a state and I can't charge tuition to my students who are in state, 100% of the revenue that I receive from enrolling those students comes from my state legislature, which isn't excited about giving me a lot of money. So if I want the revenue that I need to provide a high quality education, I got to go out of state, right? And I got to go more out of state than I have been in the past. So that's another unintended consequence and sort of trade-off that free gets you, that universities find that this revenue is useful. I mean, you mentioned this earlier in this podcast, Alex, about how one way to increase access is to start charging tuition because you have the revenue to fund the spaces.
I mean, if you look at Australia, when they first introduced tuition fees, 1988, and they brought in their loan program at the same time, everyone was convinced that this would affect access, but it never... Negatively, that's right. But of course it didn't, because literally all that new money went into expand spaces. Same thing with the UK. In 1997, they went from zero free tuition to £1,000 a year, and in 2006 they went up to £3,000 a year. And in both cases, expansion was the result. So institutions don't care where the resources come from. So you could have a perfectly fair free tuition system as long as you were prepared to pour an awful lot of money in it. But as soon as you start restricting that money, institutions are going to start looking for other ways they got to ration, right? They either got to get money from students who do pay something, which is international students, or in the American case, out-of-state students as well, or they ration in various ways. And then you get the problem that you have in Germany, which is, in effect, you're not discriminating on finances, but you're discriminating on academic results. And guess what? It turns out to be almost the same thing in terms of who gets in.
And another example of this, when you have these free, there is discussed in the chapter on Chile in our book, the universities, the government is going to pay them a sort of prorated or sort of flat fee for each student they enroll. And so the university can't charge them tuition anymore. So there's a lot of, there's sort of elite, prestigious public universities that are saying, whoa, that's a big cut in revenue for us when we used to charge tuition, but now what you're paying us doesn't make up for what we were charging. And they say that's gonna hurt the quality of the education we provide. I also don't want to be too sympathetic to universities whining that they don't get enough money, right? I mean, I don't want to go completely there, but I think it is something we have to consider it as a possible consequence of this.
Yeah, I mean, there's efficiency gains that can bring down costs, but there's also at some point efficiency losses when you just keep cutting costs. Yeah. And it's hard to regulate that. And I don't know if a legislature is the best instrument for regulating that, but that's up to it. It does. There are two things that I want to just ask briefly. One is, we have a semi-federalist system of higher education where we have states playing roles in this intermediary roles between institutions. That's got to be different from most other countries. We're talking about Brazil. That's a big country, but nonetheless doesn't have this same federalist. So what does that play into just even the notion of trying to bring these reforms to the U.S.?
Your best comparator there is north of the border. It's Canada, where I would argue the federal government has taken an even less intrusive role than, so the provinces in Canada have a much bigger role than states do here. It's similar in the sense that the federal government has a role in student assistance, the federal government has a role in research. The federal government in Canada has never really tried to leverage its role in financing to force its way into policy making. Now, partly we've had a separatist threat in one part of the country for most of the last 50 years.
And that'll do it.
That'll do it. That really does.
More secessional.
It makes
federal government.
Don't knock it. I mean, that has been an issue. But I think by and large, that balance is, but we run into the same problems, right? I mean, it was interesting. I think Canadians saw the defects in the Sanders-Clinton approach faster than some Americans did, right? Because we get to every once in a while, somebody does this. Like, let's get them to roll back tuition. Let's make free tuition. We'll make a conditional grant. And everyone says, well, wait a minute. How are you going to make a conditional grant when every single province spends a different amount now?
Yep.
If you make it free, that means it'll be expensive in Ontario and really cheap in Quebec. And
exactly.
How's Quebec going to react when it gets less money than Ontario? And I mean, this is the kind of fiscal federalism debates that we have in Canada all the time, and they don't seem to be front of mind when you have these discussions in the United States. And yet, to me, they're exactly the same. With the wrinkle that there's a public-private issue.
I think that's a really good point. And to expand on that, so, for example, a state like Vermont, we'll take Vermont, for example, that the gap between what it spends now, right, to subsidize students and what it would probably have to spend to get to free, because it can't bring in any more tuition, is big relative to, say, California, right, which is heavily subsidized. So the question is, how do you have a federal policy that takes that into account, or ignores it, and then what's the fallout from that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, reference categories will kill you across international or state borders.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter where you're at. One last question that I want to get to is just debt load. We hear about student debt in the U.S. all the time. When you talk about some of these other countries, those students must be carrying less debt. Am I right? Is this at least one area where, the U.S. is grossly out of step with other nations?
It's grossly out of step at the very top end. You're going to get a lot more students. I mean, graduate and professional debt that you see in the United States is not comparable to anywhere else in the world. At the undergraduate level, you do have a number of countries where debt is higher. Sweden, surprisingly, is one because they have free tuition, but they do lend everybody a lot of money for living expenses. The UK is higher. Canada is at least comparable.
So just to put a point on that, Sweden has free tuition and kids leave with similar undergraduate debt loads.
Yeah, 25, 30,000. Yeah.
And by the way, the free college tuition policies in the U.S. are only tuition. They aren't talking about living expenses. Right. So in New York, you still got to pay all your living expenses, and people are probably going to borrow to do that. That's the other piece of this. It says sort of failure to differentiate between living expenses and tuition.
Well, there is a lot to mine in this book, out from Harvard Education Press, International Perspectives in Higher Education, Balancing Access, Equity, and Costs. Encourage people to pick it up.
Alex, on Amazon.
It is. You can find everything on Amazon.
Although Alex,
it's nowhere else. It's just on Amazon. The monopoly. Alex, Jason, thanks for coming in and talking to us about it on the report card.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the report card. And special thanks to our guests, Jason Delisle and Alex Usher. This podcast wouldn't be possible without our team of producers and editors. So special thanks to Sophia Gallo, Cody Christensen, Macy Heath, and Gage Hurley. You can search for Report Card on Apple Podcasts, Google, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast player. And if you enjoyed it, don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes or Google. It helps other folks find the podcast. Of course, if you have any comments, questions, or topic suggestions for future episodes, reach out to us at eded.podcast@aei.org. And until the next time, I'm Nat Malkus.